She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them owned the land they stood on. Snow was falling hard over the Montana plains, thick as silence and twice as cold. December had sunk its claws deep into the land, frosting the brittle grass and clinging to the wooden beams of the Stone River Ranch like old sorrow. Wind screamed between the outbuildings, rattling loose shingles and stinging any skin foolish enough to show. May walked straight into it. Her coat was too thin, patched at the elbows, and her gloves were mismatched, one wool, one leather. But her spine held straight, and her eyes burned with a kind of fierce defiance that only women with nothing left to lose ever truly mastered. A satchel hung from her shoulder, and her boots left sharp prints across the frozen mud of the ranch yard. She stopped in front of the cookhouse, where a group of cowboys were gathered near the open fire, passing a flask and laughing low through chattering teeth. They looked up as she approached, the laughter fading one by one as they took in the sight of her. A woman, alone, asking for something in a place that gave nothing easily. A tall man stepped forward, older than the rest, with a graying beard and suspicion etched deep into his brow. His voice was gravel wrapped in whiskey. "This here's a workin' ranch, miss. Not a place for strays or stories." "I'm not a stray," May replied. Her voice was steady, low. "And I ain't here to tell stories." He looked her over. "We ain't got use for trouble, or liars, or girls who think they can sweet-talk their way out of the cold." May's jaw set. "I ain't here to sweet-talk neither." Another man, thicker, meaner in the eyes, spat on the ground. "She looks like she come from a saloon kitchen, if not the back room." That brought a ripple of crude laughter. The first man raised a hand to silence it. He stepped forward until they were nose to nose. "Well, what do you want?" May met his stare without blinking. "I can cook," she said, voice like flint. "I've worked cast iron over fire, skinned game, made sourdough in snowstorms and soup out of bones. I can feed your men with what's left in the barrel and make 'em say thank you after." There was a pause. The fire cracked behind them. "Where you come from?" he asked. May didn't answer. He leaned in closer. "This ain't no place for secrets." She lifted her chin. "I know how to cook, and I'm not turning back." The man studied her a moment longer. Then he stepped aside and nodded toward the cookhouse. "We got 36 men through winter and no proper meals in 2 days. Stove's in there. You want the job, prove it by morning." May didn't flinch. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel, and a little respect. Wouldn't kill you." He grunted, half a laugh. "We'll see about that last part." As May stepped toward the door, her eyes passed over the group again. Most looked away, some smirked, others scowled. But one man didn't move at all. He leaned against the post, arms folded, tall, with a dark coat and a brimmed hat pulled low. The only thing visible was the sharp cut of his jaw and the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He didn't speak, didn't scoff like the others, just watched. May's gaze met his for a moment too long before she pushed open the cookhouse door. Inside it was dark, cold, and smelled of grease gone sour. Pots rusted on the sideboards, a few empty tins lay scattered like fallen soldiers. But the stove stood tall in the corner, and May felt something like stubborn hope stir in her chest. She hung her satchel on the hook, rolled up her sleeves, and began. Outside, the man in the dark coat, Caleb, kept his arms crossed. He had known her face before she spoke, had seen her once in Billings years ago when she worked behind the kitchen doors of Rose Bell, that painted-up place where decent men whispered lies and left their honor outside. She had been dragged into the room one night, accused of stealing a drink, or maybe just standing too tall. A man twice her size had grabbed her by the wrist. She had not screamed, she had not cried. She had just stood there, spine like iron, eyes full of fire, daring them to strike her down if they meant to. He had watched from the shadows then, done nothing. And now she was here, snow in her hair and defiance in every step. He said nothing, just turned back toward the bunkhouse, the firelight flickering behind him. A storm was coming, outside and in. And it had her name. May rose before the moon had fled the sky. The cold bit into her bones as she pulled on her boots and coat, the same threadbare ones she had arrived in. Snow had drifted against the cookhouse door overnight, and it took her shoulder and a hard push to open it. Inside, the air was colder than outside until she got the stove going. She chipped ice from the water barrel, fed the fire with pine kindling, and waited until the heat began to chase the breath fog from the air. Her fingers stung, her back ached, but she moved like a woman who had lived through worse and planned to keep living. 15 cowboys meant 15 mouths. She mixed the flour into stiff dough, sliced thick strips of salted pork, and fried them slow over cast iron. The biscuits were hard-edged but hot. She served them with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. At first, the men muttered. One asked where the real cook was. Another laughed too loud and said she must have poisoned the beans. By the third morning, they came early to the benches. They scraped their plates clean and passed the coffee pot like it was treasure. No one praised her out loud, but they ate every crumb. May worked quietly, efficiently. She cleaned the pans herself, scrubbed the table, and even swept the ash from the corners of the cookhouse when no one asked her to. Caleb was always there before the others. He never said much. Just stepped into the cookhouse around the same hour each morning, lifted the logs into the firebox without being asked, and left without ceremony. She'd nod in thanks. He'd tip his hat, barely. He avoided her eyes. May noticed. He spoke with the others, sat with them at meals. But with her, there was a silence, not the kind that spoke of judgment, but of distance, like he was holding something behind his eyes and didn't trust it to stay buried if she looked too long. And yet, he was the only one who carried an extra bucket of water without being told, the only one who left a new bar of soap by the wash basin when hers wore down, the only one who straightened the step when it iced over, after he saw her slip once near the woodpile. It was a strange kindness, wordless, but steady. One evening, May was hauling a bucket of melted snow across the frozen yard when her boot caught on a slick patch of ice. She slipped hard, the bucket flying from her grip, water splashing across the white ground. The breath knocked out of her chest, pain spiking up her wrist as she hit the ground. She hissed, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Before she could sit up, arms wrapped around her shoulders. Caleb. He had crossed the yard in seconds, faster than she thought a man could move. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. May blinked. His face was close, framed by the dark brim of his hat. His hands were warm through his gloves, holding her steady. She nodded once, breathing shallow. "I'm fine." He helped her stand, one hand braced on her elbow, the other supporting her back. When she was upright, he let go immediately and took a step back, like he had crossed some invisible line and was trying to return before it cost too much. May looked at him. He looked away. "Thank you," she said, voice quiet. He only nodded and turned back toward the barn without another word. That night, as she sat near the stove, cleaning her scraped palm, she thought about the way he had looked at her, like she was someone he recognized but could not name aloud. He had the air of a man keeping his distance, not out of disdain, but fear, or maybe guilt. May had known many kinds of silence in her life. Caleb's silence was different, and she could not help but wonder what it was he was afraid to say. It started with a whisper. Red Callahan, a brash young cowboy with a sharp tongue and a thirst for trouble, had ridden into town 3 days prior for supplies. When he came back, his saddlebags were heavy with flour and beans, but his mouth was heavier still. He waited until supper, when the fire crackled and the men had full bellies, before he leaned back on his elbows and said it like a joke, but with poison on the edges. "I seen her before," he said, nodding toward the cookhouse where May worked alone. "Back in Billings, at the Rose Bell." The name settled over the camp like ash. Everyone knew the Rose Bell, a brothel that posed as a saloon sitting just off Main, with velvet curtains, cheap whiskey, and girls who smiled whether they wanted to or not. Red smiled wide, his teeth yellowed. She wore an apron then, too, always smelled of sage and smoke. She was the cook, sure, but you know how them girls get pulled upstairs once the whiskey runs low. The men chuckled, some uncomfortably, others with that cruel ease born of boredom and bitter winters. No one questioned Red, not really. They just let the words take root. May didn't hear it that night, but she felt it the next morning. The Cowboys filed into breakfast slower than usual. They didn't meet her eyes. The usual clatter of metal and voices was muted. One man coughed, muttered something under his breath. Another set his plate down near the door, not at the table. They were polite, but they were no longer kind. And May knew. She knew that look, the sideways glances, the lowered voices, the way good men became strangers once they thought they knew a piece of your past. He did not say a word. She stirred the beans, sliced the bacon, served the coffee. Her hands worked the same rhythm, but her shoulders had stiffened. The smile she sometimes wore, thin but real, was gone. Her eyes stayed low. At noon, no one sat beside her near the fire. At dusk, no one asked if she needed help with the water buckets. And yet, she said nothing. Because what could she say? She had worked at Rosebell. She had cooked meals, not sold herself. But that distinction rarely mattered to the kind of men who looked at women like her and only saw one thing. May had learned long ago that defending yourself too hard only made you seem guiltier. Let them talk. She had survived worse. But Caleb had heard it too. He had not laughed when Red made his comments. He had not looked amused or curious. He had gone silent, staring into the fire, like it might explain something he had long been struggling with. And when, that afternoon, Red made another crude remark, something about leftover girls and leftover stew, Caleb moved. No warning, no raised voice. Just a hard, fast punch that cracked against Red's jaw like thunder. Red hit the ground hard, spitting blood, stunned. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, holding his face. Caleb said nothing. He stood over Red for a breath, fists clenched, chest heaving. Then he turned and walked away, not speaking, not looking at anyone, including May, who had seen the whole thing from the shadow of the cookhouse door. That night snow began to fall, soft and steady, like ash from a high place. May stayed up later than usual. The kitchen was clean, the stove banked low, but she sat near the warmth, her fingers tight around a chipped mug of tea she had saved from her own wages. She didn't know what to make of what she had seen. Why had Caleb hit Red? Why now? Why not say something to her? She wasn't sure if it was pity, or guilt, or something else she dared not name. The knock came just past 10. Soft, barely there. May stood slowly, heart tight in her chest, and opened the door. There was no one outside, just the snow and a small basket on the stoop. Inside, a dozen brown eggs, still warm from the hen, a sack of cornmeal wrapped in cloth, tied tight with rough twine. No note, no name. But she knew. The eggs were from the roost near the barn, Caleb's chore always. The cornmeal bore the mark of the town general store, the same trip Red had returned from. Caleb had gone too. May knelt in the doorway, brushing a flake of snow from the edge of the basket. Her breath came out in clouds. The wind didn't bite as hard as before. She picked it up, cradled it close, and stepped back inside. For the first time in days, she let herself smile. Just a little. She didn't understand him, not yet. But maybe she didn't have to. Not tonight. Tonight, someone had remembered her worth, quietly, without demand. And that was enough. The fire had long since gone out, but Caleb could not sleep. He lay on his cot in the bunkhouse, eyes open to the dark, listening to the wind thread through the gaps in the wall like a whispered warning. Outside, snow drifted over the plains, soft and soundless, but inside his chest, memory burned like a brand. He could still see her 3 years ago, at the Rose Bell in Billings. That night had never left him. They had gone to celebrate, his friends, raucous and loud, drunk on whiskey and the thrill of closing a land deal with men twice their age. Caleb had not wanted to go, but he was young then, quieter than he is now, and it had been easier to nod than argue. He remembered the heavy perfume, the stale air of bourbon and sweat, and he remembered her. She had not looked like the others. No bright lipstick, no hungry smile. She wore an apron, her hair pulled back in a practical twist. She carried a tray of drinks with quiet focus, weaving between tables like she was trying not to be seen. But then the floor had been wet, and she slipped. The tray crashed. Liquor spilled. One of the older men, some big-name merchant, had roared with rage. "You filthy saloon tramp," the man spat. "Think dressing like a lady makes you one?" Another man grabbed the strings of her apron and yanked. She staggered. Her hands shook, but she straightened. Her eyes, he never forgot her eyes, looked right at them, unflinching, defiant. And he did nothing. Caleb had stood there, his fists clenched, his mouth full of sand. He was 23, just old enough to know what was right, and too cowardly to do it. He saw her then. He remembered her now. The same woman who now rose at dawn to cook meals for men who wouldn't meet her gaze, who scrubbed the cookhouse with aching hands, who never asked for thanks. Caleb sat up, swung his legs over the side of the cot. The wood was cold beneath his feet. He pulled on his coat, stepped into the wind. He walked slowly across the snow-covered yard toward the cookhouse. The light inside was dim but still glowing. He knew she stayed up late, fixing what could be mended, salvaging what others would throw away. He crouched and laid a bundle of dry wood on her stoop. No note, no knock. But tonight, he did not walk away. He stepped behind the red brush growing near the edge of the wall and watched through the faint opening in the canvas curtain. She sat near the stove, mending the frayed shoulder of her work shirt, her brow furrowed with focus, her fingers careful and quick. There was something reverent in her stillness, like the world had always hurt her, but she still met it with quiet dignity. Caleb felt shame rise again, thick and bitter. In her he saw everything he had once lacked: courage, pride, survival. He had stood by once. He would not do it again. Inside the cookhouse, May paused. She stared at the flame for a long moment, then backed down to her needle. Her shoulders tightened. She remembered him. She had seen him that night in Billings, not just standing there, but watching and choosing silence. She had not hated him for it, not exactly, but she had resented the hope, brief and foolish, that someone might speak for her when her own voice had been drowned out. And yet, since she had come to Stone River, it was Caleb who helped her lift the heavy water pots, who chopped extra wood for her fire, who left things without ever asking for thanks. He never said a word, but he never walked away either. May's heart beat heavy in her chest. She did not know what to make of him, and maybe she did not want to know. But then the fire came. That same night, as snow began to fall in heavier flakes, a gust of wind from the north swept through camp. Someone had stacked dry timber too close to the rear of the cookhouse. A stray ember from the stove, too small to notice, caught the pile. Within minutes, flame roared up the wall, crackling like fury set loose. Yelling broke through the night. Men scrambled, someone banged on doors, but May, exhausted, had fallen asleep on the cot near the stove and did not stir. Until Caleb came. He did not wait. He crashed through the smoke, pulled his coat over her, lifted her in his arms and turned his back to the fire as it licked down the wall. Sparks caught on his sleeves. The heat burned his cheek, but he held her close and did not stop. When she awoke, coughing against his chest, her eyes opened to find his face, so close, so raw. He looked down at her, and in that gaze there was no shame, no memory of who she had been or where they had met. There was only the now, the girl he had once failed, and the woman he refused to fail again. The days grew colder, and the snow packed tighter over the hills like white wool stitched into the earth. Each morning, before the bunkhouse stirred, Caleb came to the cookhouse. He would mumble something about needing coffee or checking the firewood, but May knew the truth. His eyes always drifted toward the small, black kettle on the back burner, the one she filled with leftover soup from the night before. Every time he came in, his hand would hover, just for a breath, then curl around the warm handle of the tin cup she had filled minutes before. Huh? He never thanked her aloud. She never pointed out that it had been poured before he arrived. It was a strange piece, unspoken, but not unnoticed. May had begun keeping a small ledger tucked under the flour sacks, not for numbers, but for memories. Her mother's handwriting, once scribbled on scraps of linen, now faded from age, was slowly being copied by May's own calloused hands into neat, determined lines. Cornbread without sugar, beef stew with root vegetables, molasses pudding thick enough to make a cowboy sit still. Recipes, yes, but more than that, dreams. One day, perhaps, a little place of her own, a kitchen without stairs, a sign that said, "Welcome," and meant it. She was stirring a pot of onion broth when Caleb stepped in again, snow dusting his shoulders. "Coffee's hot," she said, not looking up. He nodded, moved toward the counter and picked up the tin cup already waiting. Steam curled from the rim. He sipped, quietly. After a moment, she asked without turning, "What did you used to think I was?" He paused, then, slowly, set the cup down. "I thought you were strong," he said. "Even when I first saw you, at the bell, you didn't flinch." She stopped stirring. He added, quieter, "But I also thought I was afraid." "Of me?" she asked. "Of myself?" he said. "Afraid of what it said about me, that I stood there and watched, afraid I was no better than the men who laughed." The silence that followed was not cruel. It was heavy with history. Then he said, "I've thought of that night every day since." She turned, finally. Her eyes found his. "Why tell me now?" "Because I owe you more than soup and split wood." May stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is this what you do, carry guilt and hope it turns into redemption?" Caleb winced. "I do not know what I am doing. I just know I want to be something better than I was." She studied him, the man who had become less of a mystery and more of a question. And maybe that was why she asked, gently, "So who are you now, really?" He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "I am Caleb Stone." May blinked. "Stone? As in Stone River Ranch?" He nodded. "My father owns it. I was raised here, but I left after the war. Came back last spring and asked him not to tell the men who I was. I wanted to work, not be handed something I didn't earn." May's face went still. "So all this time," she said, voice low, "you've been watching from behind a mask." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I've been trying to earn your truth with mine." She shook her head, backing away. "You men, you all wear faces. Pretend to be better than the last, but you're still watching, still deciding what a woman is worth based on her past." "Not you," Caleb said. Her breath hitched. "Then why lie?" "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just didn't lead with a name that never fed a horse or built a fire." She looked away. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the cold pressed closer. May turned back to the stove, stirred the soup again. Caleb waited. Finally, she ladled some into a bowl and set it on the table. "It's hotter than before," she said, "but it cools fast." He sat, slowly, took the spoon in hand, and with a gentleness she hadn't expected, he said, "So do most things worth waiting for." May said nothing, but she did not leave the room, and she did not turn away. The dawn was a pale smear across the snow, barely breaking the long shadow of the ridge, when May packed her things into a canvas satchel. Her hands moved in practiced silence, folding her one spare apron, tying a scarf around her hair, tucking the leather-bound cookbook beneath her arm. She left the fire untended, the coals cold from the night before. Her boots crunched softly as she crossed the frozen yard. The bunkhouse was still quiet. Even the horses had not begun their restless stamping, just wind whispering, like regret. May paused by the cookhouse door, her gaze sweeping the porch where Caleb sometimes stood before sunrise, pretending to sip coffee. There was no sign of him. She let out a breath. Her heart didn't ache. It burned, like something was being torn from bone. Inside, the shelves still held her jars of pickled onions, her spices wrapped in waxed paper, a loaf of bread cooling too slowly to matter. But it was not hers. It never had been. This had always been someone else's ranch, someone else's fire. She left her key, just a bent nail on a string, hooked beside the stove, and she walked out. Caleb did not sleep that night. Snow had started falling again, dry and restless, flitting in thin flurries that caught in his hair and melted down the collar of his coat. He stood outside the dark cookhouse for hours, watching the smokeless chimney, the still windows. He had said nothing when she left, not because he did not want to stop her, but because he knew how many men had tried to trap her in soft words. He would not be another. Instead, he stayed up, hollowed by silence, thinking of everything he should have said and never did. The fire in his chest was not just guilt. It was the ache of a man who had come too late, with too little. When the snow thickened, he turned inside, sat at the narrow table May had scrubbed clean every morning, and reached for the old book she always kept near the flour sacks. Her mother's recipes, her dream. He hesitated, then tore a page from the back, a blank one, and began to write. The letter was short, but it cost him more than anything he had spoken aloud. If I were someone else, if time could be rewound like a reel of thread, I would be the man who knelt to wipe that floor for you, not the man who watched and turned away. You stood taller than I ever have. You still do. I do not ask you to forgive me, only to know this. When you stepped into my fire, it was the first time I felt warm. Caleb. He folded the letter carefully, slid it inside the front cover of her cookbook, and left it on the edge of the kitchen table, where she would not miss it if she ever came back. But he did not expect her to. Not after everything. May found the letter on the third night. She had made it only as far as the boarding house in town, her savings enough for 1 week's cot and cold tea. The cookbook had been tucked into her bag, unread, unopened, until now. She had been trying to rewrite a new soup on the last page when she felt the thin edge of paper slide free. She unfolded the letter slowly, read it twice, then pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, the snow howled against the thin window panes. Wind screamed like a storm without end. But inside her, something softened. Not the pain, that would take time, but the belief that maybe, just maybe, not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could not ignore. The sun spilled gold over the Montana plains, soft and slow, warming the wood beams of a small building nestled beside the old trail, once used by cattle drives, now leading to something gentler. A carved sign swayed above the door in the breeze. May's table. The front porch was wide, with benches where old cowboys smoked their pipes and kids giggled over biscuits with jam. Inside, the air always smelled like cinnamon and smoked pork, and the walls held shelves of books and jars of preserves. The long wooden counter held a fresh pie every morning, and behind it, always, was May. Her hands were firm, her laughter easy now. She no longer flinched at raised voices or loud boots. She wore her apron with pride and kept a painted tin by the window, labeled Dreams, where she taught local girls to save what little they had for something that mattered. Outside, Caleb dug in the herb garden, his sleeves rolled up, hands thick with soil. He spoke to the basil like an old friend, and trimmed the tomatoes with the care of a man who knew what it meant to start over. He still did not speak much, but when he looked at May, it was without shame or shadow. Every Saturday, children from the village gathered by the back door. May taught them how to knead dough, how to tell when the oil was too hot, how to laugh when flour landed in your hair. She told stories while she stirred the stew and never once mentioned the past, unless someone asked. Sometimes travelers would stop in. A stranger, catching wind of the place, would lean across the counter and ask, "Ma'am, you sure do cook like you've been doing this forever. Where'd you learn?" May would wipe her hands on her apron, glance at Caleb as he sliced onions behind her, and smile. "I used to cook for drunks who never knew my name," she'd say, "but now, I cook for a man who looks me in the eye." And that was enough. No one asked again. The day of their wedding was small. The meadow was quiet, lit by late spring sun, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. May wore a dress she had sewn herself, nothing fancy, just cream linen and a blue ribbon Caleb had found washed up in an old drawer. He wore his best shirt and his quiet smile. They stood beneath a crooked oak, with 2 witnesses and a preacher who barely cleared his throat. But the Wong moment lingered longer than any sermon. At the end, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Not lace, not silk, just soft cotton, embroidered with one word in faded red thread. Forgiven. He tied it gently around May's wrist, like a vow that needed no voice. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you for staying when I gave you every reason not to." They turned together toward the trail, hand in hand, sunlight catching the embroidery on her wrist. They had no need to run anymore. They had built something that could not be burned, not by fire, not by shame, not even by memory. And that was the beginning of everything.